One of the most interesting fights on this entire card, we have Brazil's Diego Ferreira taking on Gregor the Gift Gillespie. For Gillespie, he was already gifted a co-main event slot. He was supposed to be taking on Brad Riddell, but unfortunately with Riddell, the Volkanovski camp, going into his fight against Brian Ortega, there were some COVID complications, so Gillespie has to regroup, and he was initially supposed to take on such an accredited striker in Riddell, to now a really dynamic fighter in Diego Ferreira. And you might be down on Diego because he had that weird split decision loss to Beneil Dariush in their rematch, which is pretty much a carbon copy of their first fight. And you might say, well, listen, he lost that fight. I think he lost that fight. You think he lost that fight. JHK might have given him a little bit too many props over in the interview, which is on the channel. You got to check it out. But the whole of it is, Diego Ferreira is a good striker. He's a really crafty striker, and he gets it. And he talked about that with JHK. They said, listen, you know, you have so many training partners at Fortis, so many guys that really push me. I kind of get nervous about sparring there because it's with the likes of like an Abdulrazak Al-Hassan and so on and so forth. Like, I got to really kind of keep my head on tight and worry about these guys. So for Diego, you look at it. He's got his own gym. He's so good at jiu-jitsu. He's so good with his top pressure. And you've seen that out of a lot of his fights. I mean, who do we have to kind of pick on? The Anthony Pettis fight?
That was a great performance.
Looked great in that one. The only thing that you can really pick out is when Diego fights the really, really good wrestlers, the really, really good strikers. Sometimes he doesn't come out on the losing end. Sometimes you fight Dustin Poirier and you get finished. It happens. Sometimes you lose 2 times to Beneil Dariush. And there's a lot of top control in those fights. About 7 minutes plus, 7 to 8 minutes of top control for Beneil in both of those fights. Now he's taking on the highest level of wrestler you have out there in Gregor Gillespie. Like, this is like Olympic caliber wrestling, coupled with, I wouldn't say the best striking, but all right striking in Gregor. He's a guy that trains at a Belmore Kickboxing in New York, and we've seen some fighters like the Andre Harrisons kind of posing in the pictures, the World Series and PFL fame Andre Harrison. But from Gregor Gillespie, it's just the fact that he got put on the biggest posters last time out that I think really draws back from this fight.
It really does, and it sucks, too, because, like, you know how once a year Giannis will get put on a poster, and then people try to clown him, they're like, ha, is he the MVP? Well, yeah, he is. Like, that individual play does not sum up that person's whole resume, and it does suck, because the only memorable thing about Gregor Gillespie's career up until this point, and again, that sounds very disrespectful as I say it, but that's probably with Gregor Gillespie. Like, his best win's probably over Vince Pichel. He beat Yancy Medeiros, a good win. Like, he has
the Jordan Rinaldi fight was good.
Jordan Rinaldi's okay at best. So again, those performances don't really stand out, and that's the problem for Gregor Gillespie. I think his skill level is at a much higher level than what his opponents have been at up until this point. Like, Gregor Gillespie hasn't had a competitive fight in the UFC. Even in his loss, it wasn't all that competitive. Now, yes, it was a little back and forth on the feet up until the finish, but Gregor Gillespie, he either has 100% top control, dominant wrestling in his fights, and he just frustrates his opponents to the point where they either give up the neck for the submission, or he's able to ground and pound them just by the fact that his opponent really can't get up to their feet. Look at the Yancy Medeiros fight for that. But Gregor Gillespie, when I think of Gillespie, really the first thing I think about in his game is just the absurd physical strength he must have. Because he is one of those fighters that you just look at and you're like, how is he able to just hold these people like Jordan Rinaldi, like Vince Pichel on the ground, who are big guys for the weight division, but you just see the ease that Gillespie has with really grounding these fighters. It's impressive. And this fight will be interesting because for Gillespie, I know he's been out for a little over 2 years, and I'm sure his game has grown a little bit in that time, but I still think Gregor Gillespie is going to be that same fighter that we saw in the Medeiros, the Pichel, and the Lee fight. He's going to strike a little bit, but when the going gets tough, he's going to resort to his wrestling. But against a guy like Diego Ferreira, who is so crafty with his scrambles, who's so good at jiu-jitsu, who can strike too, it'll be interesting to see what does Gillespie do if A, he can't get the takedown, or B, if Diego can get on top of Gillespie, because this is the one difference in this fight. If Gillespie's on top of Diego Ferreira, yes, he might get some ground and pound off. Yes, he might get some good positions, but it's not a game over stage for Diego Ferreira if he's on his back. If they're in opposite positions though, and Gregor Gillespie is under Diego Ferreira, it's over. I'm almost like, I cannot describe the difference in their levels of jiu-jitsu once it's on the mat. And if you have a wrestler on their back against someone like Diego Ferreira who is so high level, it's going to spell disaster for Gillespie. But this fight really is just so interesting because both guys are really well-rounded. And the fight that I really liked from Diego Ferreira was his fight against Mirbek Taisumov at UFC 242. Because Taisumov was that, like, he was the original dark horse of the division.
His legs are giant, his takedown defense is great, he can knock out a horse, and now he's fighting with a bit of a a hometown advantage in that one, too.
Exactly, but he was one of those fighters. He was the original Beneil Dariush. He was the original Diego Ferreira. He was the guy who the ranked fighters don't want to fight because he doesn't have a big enough crowd behind him. He doesn't have that many fans, but he's such a dangerous fighter. Diego Ferreira, oddly enough, had insane cardio in the hottest arena ever and just beat the brakes off Taisumov, but on the feet. And that was the most impressive part about that fight because Taisumov had so many first-round stoppages, just so many stoppages up until that point that if Ferreira won, you had to assume that he was going to make it an MMA fight. And the fact that he really was able to show that his striking had reached that other level was just so impressive from Ferreira. So for this fight, I think if it's on the feet, Ferreira's going to have a lot of success with the somewhat basic striking of Gillespie, but I do think Gillespie's going to be able to get that takedown throughout this fight.
And that's the thing, like, you look at Gregor Gillespie overall, his entire body of work, maybe not the best names. I mean, again, Gleico Franca, Andrew Holbrook, Jason Gonzalez, Jordan Rinaldi, Vince Pichel, Yancy Medeiros, but it's the fact that, listen, Rob Dvalishvili had a big fight against Cody Stamann. It had to happen. Rob looked great. And you can talk about, he had the takedown records before he fought him, but now we've seen Merab get that big win over a good wrestler, Cody Stamann, and his striking looked really good in that. This is the opportunity for Gregor Gillespie to have that Merab type of fight. Because if you go through 6 takedowns against Yancy, 7 against Pichel, then he had the 1 against Rinaldi, but it was all he needed. He had 4 against Gonzalez, 5 against Gleico Franca. You love to see those numbers, and you love to see the fact that he averages more than 7 per 15 minutes. But the trouble is, this is the fight that he needs to have. For Diego Ferreira, this is kind of like the comeback fight that he needs to have. Because before, the Beneil Dariush fight, I thought that he lost it. I thought Beneil won. I don't see it as a split. Listen, a judge scored it differently than I did, but most people had it for Beneil. But the point is, it was a fight of the night. He had a performance of the night over Anthony Pettis. Now, listen, I get it. Anthony didn't look good against Clay Collard. He looked good against Alex Morono, who we're going to talk about later on. But Anthony Pettis is kind of hot and cold, and Diego looked really good on that.
And that's the type of fighter that Anthony Pettis does lose to. That's just a stylistic nightmare for a guy like Pettis.
But before that, Kabilov, that's a big win. Nelson, that's an all right win. That was on short notice. That's fair. Gordon, Olivier Aubin-Mercier, and then the fight that you talked about. He outstruck Mairbek Taisumov, a guy who has great leg kicks, and I talked about how big his legs are, but he really did utilize the leg kicks. But then we focused before even Olivier Aubin-Mercier. It's Dustin Poirier, Beneil Dariush, and before that, I mean, you're going back too far, but you're still going with a knockout of the night performance over Ramsey Nijem, and before that, Colton Smith, who had one of the toughest runs in MMA, just in the UFC. So, you've got really different fighters here. You've got a really interesting path to victory for both guys. So let's talk about the odds because we need to. Diego Ferreira opened a plus 165 underdog. He's a plus 151. For Gillespie, open to minus 190. He's now minus 183. And if we have a look at Tapology for the total votes, 920 of them, 71% Gillespie, 79% by decision. 29% of fans have Ferreira to win, 60% by decision. It should be noted, too, that, again, you brought it up. Gillespie hasn't fought since late 2019, so it's been a year and 5 months. For the man himself, Diego Ferreira, it was almost, and it will be, about 3 months ago that he fought Beneil Dariush in that absolute dogfight. He said in the interview with JHK that he only took a few days off, and then he was right back to training. I'm eager to see this fight, man.
I'm really excited for this. I do think Gregor Gillespie is going to make his triumphant return in this fight. I just think he can get the takedown on Diego, and Diego will be able to get the takedown on Gillespie. And at the end of the day, it's really just as simple as that. I think Ferreira can have more success on the feet, but only for so long until Gillespie decides to ground this fight. So I am ever so slightly going to pick Gregor Gillespie, but I do think this fight's going to be absolutely wild.
I've had a hard time with this one. I really have, because for Gillespie, look on the socials. I don't put too much stock into it, but he's not one of those guys that's out there posting glam pics every day. But you look at the shape this guy's in, and holy crap, he's been training every day. He just hasn't been hunting, fishing, and loving every day. He's been training in the gym at Belmore. And for Diego, you know exactly what you're going to get every time, but his takedown defense is a little bit suspect. Now, sometimes it works to his advantage. He can get taken down to submit somebody, but in a fight against Gregor Gillespie, he can't get taken down because he's just going to stay on top of you, and he's going to advance position. He's going to look to land some shots. So it is a really tricky one for me. I have the underdog Diego Ferreira in this one too, because again, listen, I worry about it off his back. Is he great at getting submissions?
No.
Not 100%. But as the fight wears on, I do like Diego Ferreira. I like him with the striking. I like him with his jiu-jitsu abilities. And for Gregor Gillespie, he's got to prove it to me. This is the opportunity. If Gregor Gillespie gets this one, like I said, just like Merab last week, where he took on a tough out in Cody Stamann, this is the prove me fight. Merab was around the same in terms of the odds as Gregor Gillespie is in this fight too. If you want to compare apples to apples, I'll compare an apple to a crab apple. But this is what I'm going with. I am slightly going, though, with Diego Ferreira.
I don't see a world where Diego Ferreira wins this fight, and I normally don't go against you this hard, but this fight really does come down to the wrestling. My issue is that Diego Ferreira's jiu-jitsu is a lot more similar to Jacques Array than it is to Brian Ortega in this regard, where Diego needs to have top position to really get submissions. He can get the back, of course, but most of his submissions come from the top. He doesn't have the best sweeps off the ground. Can he get them? Yes, but even looking at Beneil Dariush, Beneil Dariush is a good wrestler. I wouldn't say he's a great wrestler. He's a great grappler, but he's a good wrestler, and he was able to out-wrestle Diego Ferreira. Now, he was able to stay on top because Beneil Dariush is, I believe, a second-degree black belt in jiu-jitsu. Someone who is very adept on the mat. I just think the top control and the overall pressure of Gillespie is going to tire out Diego Ferreira. It's a lot easier to fight and really have an elevated output when you're fighting against a guy like Mirabek Taisimov, who at the time was just fighting backwards a lot in that fight. It's easy to go out there and get a good win over Anthony Pettis when stylistically you're just a tough matchup for him. The fact that Diego couldn't take down Beneil Dariush is just tough for me. I think Gregor Gillespie is going to ground him in this fight, and I do think Gillespie's probably going to win a pretty one-sided decision.
Can't wait to see what happens, Matt. The return of Gregor Gillespie. You got him. I've got Ferreira. I love the fight. I can't wait to see it. We've got a great card coming up. Cerrone's taking on Morono. Rodriguez taking on Waterson. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night picks. And as we always say, let's get into it.